Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Philip Steenkamp, President and Vice Chancellor of RRU University, and I'm going to be your host today. I'd really like to welcome Dr. J.P. Catungal, today's presenter, who I will be introducing shortly. I'd also like to welcome and share my thanks to Associate Director of Human Rights and Accessibility, Alejandro Campos Garcia, who organized today's session. And of course, I would like to welcome all of you here with us today in this virtual room. Of course, here at Royal Roads, we always like to begin in a good way by acknowledging that Royal Roads campus is located on the traditional lands of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Songhees and Esquimalt nations. And it is indeed with great gratitude that we live and work and learn here with the past, present, and future of Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, faculty, and staff come together. So just a few housekeeping items, and then we'll get started. Your microphones have been muted to begin today, but you can ask questions by either unmuting yourself during the Q&A or by using the chat, and then our moderator will read them out during the Q&A session toward the end of the talk. Of course, feel free to have your camera on or off, whichever you prefer, but I would say it's always nice to see a few friendly faces as we connect virtually as well. And a note to everybody that today's session is being recorded and will be available to watch after the event. So this is Asian Heritage Month, and it's Asian Heritage Month at Royal Roads University, and we've been celebrating the month by sharing resources and voices from our university community. And this month, we in fact invited some of our students to share more about their Asian heritage and what this month means to them, with a particular focus on the rich traditions, diverse languages, and creative arts that shape and connect Asian communities. And on May 26th, we're going to be welcoming Dr. Fred Chow, Assistant Professor in the University of Victoria's Counseling and Psychology program, for a hybrid event. And he will present on intergenerational trauma and resilience in the Asian diaspora. And you will be able to find the link to that hybrid event in the chat. So I hope to see many of you there as well. And for more details on these voices and events, please visit our Asian Heritage Month webpage, and the link is also in the chat. I really encourage you to take a look if you haven't had a chance yet. So before I begin my introduction, I would like to start by expressing our support and solidarity for and with the Filipinx community after the tragic events that happened late last month in Vancouver. JP, I know you were involved in community response efforts, and this was a tragic loss felt by all of us, and we offer our deepest condolences to everyone affected. In my family, I have, through my daughter's partner, an extended Filipinx family community in Vancouver, and it was a very traumatic time for all of us as well. So we just wanted to begin with that acknowledgement. So today I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. J.P. Catungal, Assistant Professor in the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality and Social Justice at the University of British Columbia. He is an interdisciplinary scholar of critical geography and feminist and queer of color theorizing. He has taught in the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality and Social Justice and the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program for a decade. As a first-generation queer and racialized academic from a working-class migrant family, JP has experienced alienation at universities. And his goal as an educator is to make teaching and learning spaces more equitable for everyone, in part by centering historically marginalized communities' knowledges in curricula. And in today's presentation, I know he will draw from his interdisciplinary Asian Canadian research, teaching, and public engagement practice to articulate the value of critical scholarship for our communities, by our communities. And such engaged scholarly practices in direct partnership with equity-deserving communities has much to contribute to how we understand the public role of the university today, including our responsibilities and how we build fairer, more meaningful connections with the wider community. JP has received various awards for his scholarly work, among them the Governor General's Gold Medal for Academic Excellence. And just last month, he was awarded the most prestigious of teaching prizes, the Killam Teaching Prize. And congratulations. Dr. Catungal, we are so grateful to have you here to speak with us today. And I will now pass the mic over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. I really appreciate the very warm welcome and very generous introduction. Let me just figure out, there we go. I think we have the screen going. Perfect. Excellent. Again, I really want to send my appreciation to all of you folks for helping mark Asian Heritage Month. Magandang tanghali po sa inyong lahat. Maong agaw at sikayo namin. Good afternoon. I'd like to offer my gratitude, especially to Alejandro Campos Garcia for reaching out to invite me to deliver this talk. To President Steenkamp again for that warm introduction, and also to Lisa Wayton for publicizing this event. And thank you all for spending part of your Tuesday with us today. Before I launch into my presentation in earnest, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm joining you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. My home institution, the University of British Columbia, is itself on Musqueam territory. It is necessary to recognize ongoing Indigenous sovereignty over lands that our institutions of education and cultural knowledge production are situated in. As these lands have been sites of meaning-making and intergenerational knowledge transmission since time immemorial, which is to say the beginnings of history and memory. As we gather in community today on this digital space to mark Asian Heritage Month, I invite those of us whose work, especially those of us whose work theorizes questions of race and place, to reflect on these issues in relation to ongoing settler colonialism. In the powerful words of Shireen Razak, Melinda Smith, and Sunura Tabani in the introduction to their 2012 book, Critical States of Race, how can we theorize our place when the place itself is stolen? I would like to ensure that I situate myself personally also on these lands. As has been mentioned, my name is JP Catungal. I'm a naturalized Canadian citizen and a first-generation immigrant from the islands now collectively known as the Philippines, so named after King Felipe II of Spain by Spanish explorer and colonizer Ruy Lopez de Villalobos. Like many immigrants before us, and certainly like the vast majority of Filipino Canadians on these lands, my parents, siblings, and I came here in search of better life. We come from a country with a history of over 400 years of Spanish, American, and Japanese imperial conquest, as well as exploitation and underdevelopment due to conditions of global capitalism. Conditioned by economic logics, the Philippines routinely exports its people as migrants and laborers to other places, a fact quite likely familiar to many Canadians who interact knowingly or unknowingly with Filipinos, especially in the fields of healthcare, retail, and food services, among other spaces. I note all of these to make the point that the histories of the there of the Philippines are linked to the histories of the here of settler colonial North America. The violence of empire is a common link between the dispossessions of global immigration and the dispossessions of settler colonialism. I do not at all mean to equate and collapse immigrant experiences with indigenous experiences. These are incommensurable, but instead to anticipate a politics of solidarity built upon a recognition of both connection as well as difference. It is also a personal reminder of the difficult but necessary task of imagining what it would mean to tether immigrant futures not to the continuation of the settler colonial state, but due to the endurance of ongoing Indigenous sovereignty. This year, as President Steenkamp has mentioned, this Asian Heritage Month has been a very heavy one. I arrived to today's keynote with ongoing pain from the grievous violence of the Lapu-Lapu Day tragedy. Held on April 26th of this year in Vancouver's Sunset neighborhood on Fraser Street, the Lapu-Lapu Day Festival was meant as a celebration of Filipino-Canadian community in Vancouver. It was named after Lapu-Lapu, one of the first to resist advancing Spanish forces in Southeast Asia and who killed Ferdinand Magellan at the Battle of Mactan in 1521. The evening of April 26, 2025, a car was driven through the crowds gathered for Lapu-Lapu Day. Many were injured physically and even more spiritually and psychologically. As of today, 11 people have so far been confirmed killed, not just from Filipino communities, but more broadly. Several more remain in critical conditions in hospitals all over Vancouver. Some 2 weeks later, I and many others remain in deep mourning. We continue to grieve those who are killed and send our love to their kin and community. With as much hope as we can muster, we hold dear in our hearts and wish a swift recovery to those still on their path to healing. Today, as I recognize this tragedy, I also hope to extend the embrace widely. As Filipino Canadians have been deeply and disproportionately affected, so too have our broader and allied communities. In these times of sheer grief, limiting categories are unable to contain the extensiveness of our losses. We need now more than ever a capacious approach to care that embraces our extended kin. We reach out with love and care to the residents, students, workers, and merchants of the Sunset neighborhood where the tragedy happened, as well as to members of LGBTQ+, Brazilian, Colombian, Vietnamese, mental health advocacy, immigrant activists, drag and dance communities, and many others who have also been so deeply affected by what happened. As migrant communities living and working under conditions of racial capitalism, Filipino communities in Canada are so intimately familiar with pain and tragedy. As my friend, the poet Carlos Sayo, has noted in a powerful poem written just a few days after the tragedy, we've lit candles and laid down flowers many times before. He asks, and I quote, "How many tragedies can a community endure?" And here we are yet again. We continue to fight for our futures, not just for survival, certainly not just for resilience, but for our community's genuine flourishing. In the aftermath of the Lapu-Lapu Day Festival, the Filipino-Canadian community and our allies have responded with bayanihan, community care, and mutual aid efforts, a good number of which were organized mere hours after the tragedy. These responses have taken many beautiful forms. Among them are direct supports to those affected, such as GoFundMe campaigns for the families of those who were killed, as well as free therapy sessions, drop-in spaces, child and elderly care, meal trains, and arts-based gatherings. The logistical and organizing work that have made these responses possible testify to the thickness of networks of capacity and leadership that exist in community. While it is tempting to read these as examples of resilience, and it's interesting that the next Asian Heritage Month event also deals with that discourse, which they may well be, and they are practices of resilience, I take direction instead from critical uptakes of resilience discourse in analyses of marginalized communities' experiences and negotiations of violence. In the introduction to the book, Resilience and the Brown Babe's Burden, the Filipino philosopher Tracy Llanera argues that resilience is a demand on marginalized communities, one that could serve to foreclose questions about the social and political conditions that produce these burdens in the first place. Anticipating celebratory uptakes of discourses of resilience as reaction to the Lapu-Lapu Day tragedy, In his poem, Carlos Tayo also notes that the Filipino-Canadian community is, quote, tired of being called resilient, just tired. In lieu of resilience discourse, we need other ways of understanding the efflorescence of these for us, by us forms of community care and organizing. The poet and school teacher Saul Diana offers an alternative. Echoing Carlos' critique, Saul also decries resilience discourse. In the poem, The Garden on Fraser and 41st, Saul Diana writes, quote, bitter taste on my tongue when I call my own people resilient. I prefer to call us by something else. Kapwa, a shared self. The poem continues. On the news, they named Saturday the darkest day in Vancouver's history. On Sunday, the candles we ignited turned Kensington Park into the night sky. We clapped at the vigil, crescendoing into an isang bagsak, one down. As in, when one falls, we all fall. Conversely, we rise together. And on Sunday, we sounded like thunder. On Saturday, our home was turned into a crime scene. On Sunday, we laid flowers to rest and turned Fraser and 41st into a garden. The social geography of Filipino-Canadian grief is a central motif in Saul's poem, particularly in the last stanza. In it, he articulates the Sunset neighborhood as home, speaking not only to the momentary community placemaking enacted through the event of Lapu-Lapu Day, but also to the longer term and more durable ways that Filipino-Canadian communities and our broader kin have made home on Sunset, particularly through our presence as business owners, customers, residents, and students, and workers as well. Saul's poem mournfully describes the way that Filipino-Canadian grief is expressed through beauty. It is significant that the poem ends not with the violence of home becoming a crime scene, but with the communal act of transforming the site anew after the tragedy. In Saul's literary imagination, Fraser and 41st represent something of a crossroads, a turning point for community. Turning the intersection into a garden denotes a communal desire to re-signify the place into a site of mourning and memory. The flowers laid to rest are indeed funerary and memorial, but it is the domestic metaphor of gardening that signals the enduring role of community labor as a key aspect of Filipino-Canadian placemaking, including after the tragedy. I meditate at length on the Lapu-Lapu Day tragedy in part because it has since stolen much of my focus and energy as both a community member and an academic. I said yes to doing this presentation before the tragedy took place, and though I did submit my title and abstract only a couple of days after, I didn't fully anticipate how much of this presentation will actually be taken up by the Lapu-Lapu Day tragedy. Since April 26, many things have happened in response. At UBC, the student groups Kababayan and Sulong organized a vigil for Filipino-Canadian community members and our allies on campus. Held on April 30th, the vigil was one of the first times that I've seen such a congregation of Filipino-Canadians at UBC, including students and faculty, as well as staff in various roles and for many spaces on campus. Administration, student support, food services, and building maintenance, among others. I was asked to offer a short address at the UBC Vigil as one of a handful of Filipino-Canadian faculty members at UBC, and indeed in the Canadian Academy. Some of the content of my address I've reworked and incorporated into this presentation, including reading out Saul's poem. In my vigil address, I also deliberately ensure that the UBC student groups understand the significance of the work that they do as forms of community support and placemaking for our communities by our communities. I noted, tayo ang ating kinakailangan ngayon. We are what we need at this moment. You are an important part of our history. As an academic, my research agenda has always been energized by an interest in how historically marginalized communities use organizing, placemaking, and storytelling as both critique and world making. A means both to name the structures, systems, and histories that shape their lives, as well as to illustrate their agentive and creative uh, capacity to respond to their lived experiences of violence, of racial violence and its intersections with cis heteronormativity and imperial capitalism. In my work, I focus mostly on these acts of meaning making and responsiveness in an attempt to dislodge the narrative and the analytical centering of victimization and helplessness as the defining characteristic of marginalized communities. In a sense, I am echoing Unanga scholar Eve Tuck's call to suspend what she calls damage-centered research, insisting insisting that the dispossessed and disenfranchised communities, I'm quoting here, are more than broken and conquered. She argues for research that focuses instead on desire. For her, desire-based frameworks are those that focus, quote, not only on the painful elements of social realities, but also the wisdom and hope. She expands, and I quote, desire accounts for the loss and despair, but also the hope, the visions, the wisdom of lived lives in communities. Desire is involved with the not yet, and at times the not anymore, end quote. In the title of my talk today and in earlier parts of this presentation, I invoke the phrase for our communities by our communities to describe the ways the historically marginalized communities show up for each other in order to respond materially to crises, as well as to name the ways that they experience structural abandonment by design from institutional systems of societal care and support. To put it in succinct, perhaps oversimplified terms, when institutions either fail or flat out refuse to address the specific needs of these communities use gathering, organizing, art, and other creative acts of fending for themselves as a means to articulate the conditions that give rise to their experiences, as well as to identify and address their needs. In other words, agentive acts of care and creativity for our communities, by our communities, shine light onto the unevenness of the scope and reach of who counts as worthy of mainstream care. They thus constitute critical analysis, drawn precisely from the embodied and community knowledge that they come from, and the very intimate spaces of individual lives and shared experiences of marginality. My impulse to name the ongoing work of Filipino-Canadian UBC student organizers and the emergent community responses to the Lapu-Lapu Day tragedy as forms of work for our communities by our communities is part of a larger effort in my scholarship to elevate the agency and creativity of historically marginalized communities in the face of longer histories of representation, knowledge production, and policy making that have marginalized Asian Canadian communities. The Academy as an institution is not innocent, but a key player in these histories of anti-Asian violence. In particular, they have underwritten representations of Asian Canadian and other racialized communities as exotic objects of curiosity to be researched and as helpless actors that need rescue, rather than as makers of knowledge and agentive political actors in our own right. My scholarly work, particularly in collaboration with other racialized communities, takes directly on the embedding of white supremacy, racism, and their intersections in the work of educational institutions. I don't have time to go into detail into my body of work today, but let me just tell you a little bit about some of them. They include partnered research projects with community organizations, including the Kwentong Pamamahay Project, an oral history project on Filipino-Canadian practices of making home in partnership with Heritage Vancouver Society and the Sliced Mango Collective, as well as an organizational history project in partnership with the Kababayan Academic Mentorship Program that documented the work of CAMP as a community-based response to the disproportionately high rates of educational incompletion among Filipino Canadian high school students in Vancouver. As community engaged scholarship, these partner projects are efforts at scholarly work where we speak from where we are able to speak, particularly from our specific embodied and analytical perspectives as Filipino Canadians in the academy and in community organizing. Through these works, we name our community's challenges and testify to the many things that we do in community to address them, often despite the barriers we face in institutions such as the education system. In addition, in collaboration with other Filipino Canadian scholars, I have organized symposia and workshops, including Filipinx, pictured here, and have edited journal special issues and books that serve to make space, especially for junior academics of color and scholarship. Along with being venues for presentations and publications, these gatherings of Filipino Canadian scholarly community also act as forms of organizing, as forms of peer support and mentorship, where we together share our experiences of the academy with each other, engage in collective theorizing about the conditions and possibility for our presence in the academy, and we circulate strategies for survival in spaces that have historically not included our bodies and our knowledges. At UBC, I continue to do the work of helping to advance the goal of intervening in the academy through my work with the Center for Asian Canadian Research and Engagement, or ACRE, and the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies Program, or ACAM. ACAM, proliferation of acronyms, a hazard of being in the university. ACAM and ACRE constitute for me key to an effort to advance research, teaching, and public engagement for our communities by our communities within the space of the academy. Let me tell you a little bit about the history of these units, in part because their emergence illustrates the importance of these kinds of interventions within the university. In March 2022, the University of British Columbia approved the creation of the Center for Asian Canadian Research and Engagement, fulfilling an institutional promise that then Dean of Arts and now University Provost Gage Averill made when UBC hosted the fully online National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic in June 2020. ACRE, even before its formal founding, was something that many of us already at UBC advocated for, to create a formal and funded space for gathering and support for Asian Canadian academics at UBC. Since its founding, I have had the honor and privilege of serving as ACRE's co-director, along with my colleague and friend, Dr. Henry Yu, historian of Chinese migration to the Americas. ACRE came into existence at a, let's say, interesting time when the ravages of the COVID-19 pandemic translated not only into a global public health crisis, but also the reinvigoration of anti-Asian racism, violence, and xenophobia as a response to the pandemic. At UBC and other institutions of higher learning, the wider societal pattern of scapegoating Asians for the pandemic translated into students of Asian descent, including and especially Asian international students, experiencing the university as a site of exclusion, microaggression, and violence. Adding to broader experiences of anti-Asian racism in Vancouver, eventually dubbed the anti-Asian hate capital of the world. This is, of course, not the first time that Asians have been targeted as a threat to the university. In 1979, the CTV series W5 aired an 11-minute segment called Campus Giveaway that argued that foreign students were taking over Canadian universities and taking spots away from Canadian read white students, to whom spots in Canadian universities are apparently entitled. The narrative came to be rehashed in 2010 when Maclean's magazine published the now infamous Too Asian article, which suggested similarly that Asians are not just taking over demographically, but also as no fun figures shifting campus culture too much through their emphasis on hard work and good grades as opposed to parties and fun. Alas, unfortunately, the scapegoating continues to have durable life, most recently resurrected in media panics and policy debates, especially about international students, as the reason for both rising tuition and an affordable and overcrowded housing market in Canadian cities. In the context of these societal attitudes about Asianness in the university, our work at ACRE is indebted to the history of ethnic studies as a method, field, and ethos of critical scholarly practice. Emerging in the United States, particularly California, through public demands and protests by Black, Asian, Chicanx, Latinx, Indigenous, and Third World communities, both within and outside the university, ethnic studies sought to ensure nothing short of a reckoning with the institutionalization of white supremacy in the academy and the radical transformation of the university into a space where differently racialized people can exercise control over university functions that affect our lives: academic hiring, curriculum development and teaching, resource allocation, and the right conduct of research on and with historically marginalized communities among them. At UBC, ACRE seeks to honor the history of ethnic studies by ensuring that we prioritize and support scholarly work for our communities by our communities. We do so through not just supporting Asian Canadian faculty and student researchers through funding allocations and the creation of spaces for scholarly exchange, but also through hosting spaces for informal community gathering that we hope serves to create and cultivate cultures and networks of peer support and mentorship. We do this work in concert with others at UBC. In March 2022, when ACRE was formally created, we joined other kin efforts at UBC to address the need for Asian Canadian interventions within the university. We work very closely, for example, with Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies, or ACAM, in the Faculty of Arts at UBC, which I am affiliated with and teach one course for. ACAM is an interdisciplinary undergraduate minor program, currently celebrating its 10th year of existence at UBC. Like other ethnic studies programs before us, ACAM was born directly from community organizing efforts. In 2012, through years of intrepid advocacy by community leader Mary Kitagawa, who is on the foreground of the image on the right, UBC apologized for its role in the expulsion of 76 Japanese Canadian students in 1942 as part of the larger internment and removal of Japanese Canadians from the Pacific coast of Canada. Along with the apology, the university awarded honorary degrees to the 76 students, and in 2014 officially created the Asian Canadian and Asian Migration Studies program as a commitment to addressing Asian Canadian histories, cultures, and communities in curriculum and student programming. Since its creation, ACAM has shouldered much more than its fair share of work to advance Asian Canadian scholarship and teaching and public engagement at UBC. For much of its history, it signified the one institutional space at UBC that Asian Canadian communities, both within and outside of the university, felt able to tap for support, especially in terms of research and policy advocacy. Because it is an undergraduate minor program with limited resources and staffing capacity, ACAM, and many of us in other parts of the university, felt compelled to do work on the side of our desks as a means of growing capacity for the kind of work that we, ACAM and ACRE, are now more able to do with the additional resources, though still not enough, that we have been able to get through internal research center grant funding. We envision ACRE as a means of extending institutional presence and capacity for our scholarly communities. At the very least, in the founding of ACRE, we hope that our existence lessens work that needs to be done off the side of people's desks and alleviate some of the research support work that ACAM has been expected to shoulder. Partnerships with Asian Canadian community organizations in Vancouver, particularly in community organizing and cultural sectors, are key aspects of our ongoing work. We ardently strive to work towards meaningful and ethical engagement with community partners in order to stop the longer history of extractive and objectifying work on historically marginalized communities that have made these communities distrust academics and the institution of the university more broadly. We have two ongoing streams that organize a good amount of our work. The first is CACHE, C-A-C-H-E, Community Archives, Collections, and Heritage Exhibitions, which brings together museum and archive practitioners in institutions as well as in community settings to think together about socially just approaches to archival and curatorial and collections practice. CACHE members include not only professionals who work in spaces like the Museum of Vancouver or UBC's Rare Books and Special Collections, but also community memory keepers in Chinatown Family Association and nonprofit organizations that serve Asian Canadian communities in this city. The second is the Browning Asian Canada series, a public scholarship and engagement series which aims to elevate Brownness as a research analytic within Asian Canadian studies, as well as to elevate the analytical perspective, especially of South Asian, Southeast Asian, and Southwest Asian communities, Asian Canadian communities. Two major public-facing events that we have organized as part of Browning, the Browning Asian Canada series, include a public talk and discussion at the Museum of Vancouver titled Shades of Brown, and the lecture performance Lessons in Drag, featuring the drag performer Dr. Lahore Bajistan. We also have an ongoing space co-sharing partnership with Hogan's Alley Society, Chinatown Celebration Society, and the Hua Foundation at 312 Main, a social innovation and community hub located in Vancouver's downtown east side. The goal of this partnership is to cultivate possibilities for collaboration and knowledge sharing across Asian Canadian, Black, and other racialized communities in Vancouver who are advocating for space and community space within the city. One key thread that ties these projects together is an active commitment to publicly relevant scholarly practice. This exists in multiple registers in our work, building relationships and fostering cross-pollinations between universities and communities, ensuring that scholarly insight have broader public relevance and community uptake, and quite critically, insisting that Asian Canadian scholarship takes form not only as journal articles or books, which are important, but also as the formation of communities of practice, art and performance, and other creative and public forms of scholarship. One final example that I'll share today, which bridges the work I do at both ACRE and ACAM, is a relatively new third-year course that I co-teach, ACAM 320J, which is research focused on community-engaged research in Asian Canadian studies. The course has been offered a couple of times now. It's a course focused on the ethics and methods of meaningful, reciprocal, and ethical research in partnership with Asian Canadian community. From the get-go, the course was conceived in partnership between me as a university-based academic and Christina Lee, Director of Community Capacity and Strategic Partnerships with the Hua Foundation. Messing explicitly with the gatekeeping of expertise, Christina and I occupy equal footing as co-instructors in the course, and we bring our specific skill sets, knowledge, and experiences working with Asian Canadian communities to our teaching practice. Me from, of course, my work as an academic, and Christina as a community leader and organizer. Crucially, ACAM 320J has both a content and an application component. Along with learning key concepts and practices of community-engaged research, students also partner directly with community organizations to design and deliver a project together The course ends with a focus on knowledge mobilization and translation through a two-part public presentation series, what you see here as the community showcase. The first one geared to institutional audiences such as policymakers, academics, and funders, and the second one geared more broadly to general publics. This poster is for the first year, and this past year, the second public showcase was held on a Saturday in Collingwood Neighborhood House in Vancouver. It was attended by some 100 something people and featured student projects in partnership with South Vancouver Neighborhood House, Sliced Mango Collective, Chinatown Today, Love Intersections, and the Punjabi Market Collective. And they dealt with a diverse set of issues, including food security, community placemaking and heritage, cultural medicines, and others. In the interest of time, and perhaps rather abruptly, let me offer some concluding comments to tie both my reflections on emergent community efforts following the Lapu Lapu Festival tragedy, and on the work that I do with ACRE and ACAM at UBC. As a Filipino-Canadian academic, I exist in multiple worlds. As a first-generation racialized academic in a historically white institution, and as a member of an immigrant community that I've described in earlier work as existing in a dual condition of invisibility and hypervisibility due to our underrepresentation in institutions of power and our overrepresentation as stereotyped racial figures in public discourse. My positionality requires of me, I think, an acute awareness of my responsibility to my community, as well as my place in the institution of the university, where I am somewhat privileged, if often overworked, as co-director of a research center devoted to advancing Asian Canadian research, teaching, and public engagement. When I accepted the invitation to address the UBC Vigil in remembrance of the Lapu Lapu Day tragedy, I was reminded very starkly of my responsibility as a Filipino-Canadian scholar within UBC. In addressing the crowd at the vigil alongside student organizers, I was moved to insist on the significant work that happens within Filipino-Canadian communities to address not just this most recent tragedy, but also the longer and more institutional forms of violence that our communities experience as a result of white supremacy and racial capitalism, including in the university. I needed in that moment to name organizing, including student organizing, as a series of efforts to create infrastructures of support and advocacy for ourselves, often in the absence or inadequacy of such infrastructures more broadly. Last week, I was invited to be part of the adjudication committee for the United Way BC's Kapwa Strong Fund. I am not at liberty, which is a fund that aims to support community efforts to address the impacts of the Lapu Lapu Day tragedy. I am not at liberty to offer too many specifics, but let me just say in broader terms that I am now more than ever more privy to the efflorescence of diverse efforts from the community to address the tragedy, both immediately and in the longer and medium terms. I said yes to serving on the adjudication committee out of a desire to do my part to support the proliferation of infrastructures that aim for better futures for our historically marginalized communities. And with the knowledge that I am afforded the privilege as a faculty member to take on such roles in the service of the community. This desire to help cultivate capacity for our communities, by our communities, is also in huge part fuel for the work that I hope I am doing with ACAM and ACRE. Through these units at UBC, I am able to collaborate with fellow faculty members, staff, and community partners to insist on the possibility of other, more collaborative, more creative, and more socially just approaches to scholarly practice. ACAM and ACRE as units within UBC are faced with a long history of Western academic white supremacy, which has reared its ugly head once again in the recent announcement of a lawsuit against UBC, alleging that EDI efforts and land acknowledgements are political statements and thus in violation of some fictive standard of institutional neutrality, as if neutrality itself is not a political position. Today's university is embattled, caught between recent, often soft commitments to reconciliation, equity, diversity, and inclusion, and resurgent conservative desires, right-wing desires, for a return to some fictional past where objectivity, truth, and neutrality reign supreme. Those of us who approach scholarship in pursuit of social justice and treat the university itself as an object for critical analysis and intervention may feel caught in the middle. But our work continues, guided partly by the same spirit of utopianism that the queer of color scholar Jose Esteban Munoz articulates in this way, quote, "The here and now is simply not enough." In my scholarship as a Filipino-Canadian academic, I look to the poets, artists, organizers, community leaders, and fellow racialized academics for inspiration. It is through their creative and critical efforts, fueled by a desire for a better world and most socially just future for our communities, that I draw inspiration. The work continues. Thank you so much.
Dr. Catungal, thank you so much for your exceptional presentation. And it was very interesting to learn about the scope of the work you are doing and your colleagues are doing, looking at the teaching and the research and the community engagement in this space. I was going to ask you a question, but you covered it, I think, in your last comments, just about the sort of backlash you are seeing and how you are on sort of navigating that. Given the time that we've got about 12 or so minutes for questions, I think what I'll do is hand it over to Alejandro Campos Garcia to facilitate a Q&A here. I'm sure there will be many questions from our audience. And so just a reminder, please write them in the chat for our moderator to read or raise your virtual hand and unmute yourself when called upon. So Alejandro, I'm going to hand this over to you, and we will ask the moderator, please, to identify people asking questions of us. But again, just a huge thank you to you for raising many sort of interesting and engaging issues. And I know we could have a much longer conversation, but let's take some time for questions.
Thank you.
Any questions?
I apologize for taking much more time than I thought I would to deliver the presentation. I hope that was interesting and useful at the very least.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe while people are gathering their thoughts, I will ask that question, which was, you began to get into it. I mean, I think we all read with some concern the legal action at UBC from a certain group there, sort of basically challenging land acknowledgements, but other things as well. And, obviously we've seen the incredible attacks in the United States on diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives, on any attempt to recognize and celebrate and support difference. Just extraordinary images we've seen in the last few days of, white Afrikaner, South African refugees arriving in the United States, affinity groups and clubs being closed down, across government, the wholesale cancellation at the University of Michigan of, what were flagship DEI programs, the departure of who was the former president at UBC, of course, to a red meat sort of state university and all of that. And I just wondered if you could reflect a little bit on what we've seen, and more importantly, sort of what message you would give our team here about, how to manage this and how to move through it.
Where do we begin? There is a lot there. I mean, your recognition that what happened at University of Michigan with Santa Ono, formerly at UBC, who was the one who got UBC to host the National Forum on Anti-Asian Racism while he was at UBC, and was the president, I think, at the time when ACRE was created, and then all of this is happening. There's a lot of very interesting reflections online, specifically on his role, but I also don't want to pick on him singularly. Although as university president, there may well be cause to do so. But I think what we are seeing is very much the kind of revanchist kind of take back institutions that and attempt to restore them to what I described as some kind of fictive past, pure of ideology, pure of social justice, which is partly to say pure of historically marginalized communities, and not just demographically, but also as representations and practitioners of forms of knowledge, of ways of being in the world, of creative practices that have historically been marginalized within the university. So I think what we are seeing, at least in part, is this kind of certainly philosophical battle, but also very much a material one over who is in place or out of place within the university. And the lawsuit itself, to me, is interesting in its use of lawfare, the courts, the legal system, as a means to litigate, literally, what the university is. Right. In the face of all of that, many of us will continue to do the work, because these conditions, in different iterations and then with different intensities, have been the conditions for the work that many of us do anyway. So, but I suppose one thing that I'll say is that it is a scary time, particularly in the context of budget cuts, etc. There's always the fear that units like mine, and my home unit is the Institute for Gender, Race, Sexuality, and Social Justice, like feminist, queer, and critical race scholar. That's where my tenure line sits. It's always already, by virtue of its positioning and its history, precarious, and made even more so by this confluence of kind of resurgent traditionalism and small c conservatism within the university, but also neoliberalism, right? We constantly still have to defend ourselves and articulate our utility, right? And also the value of the knowledge and creativity that we as scholars and as practitioners bring to the university. It's a scary time, but I wonder if there hasn't ever been a scary time in some ways. That sounds very dark, but here we are.
Yeah, well, thank you for those reflections. I mean, I think you spoke a little bit about this sort of the concept of institutional neutrality, which I think is just cover, and also the whole issue of, I've heard a lot of this discussion from my colleagues about we need to focus on core mandate right now, which I think is also cover in some ways for what's going on, because in our view here, the kind of work that you do and your colleagues do is absolutely core and should be absolutely core to the mission of a post-secondary institution.
Yeah, thank you.
I will ask, yeah, thank you. Please go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, I'm a geographer by training. My PhD is in geography, and I'm very curious about that metaphor of the core, because what accompanies it is the construction of other things that's marginal. Right?
Yeah.
So already that betrays some kind of hierarchicalization and the kind of treatment of certain things and certain people, certain bodies of knowledge in all senses of that phrase, as either in place or out of place, core or marginal to the university.
Yeah, yeah, and then it allows for dealing with the margins, right? In times of challenge, you can identify marginal things and get rid of them, right?
Yeah, and it's also, I think, premised on this idea of a kind of unchanging and unresponsive university. The conditions of academic practice shift. It has a history, and the history of today is a history in which we societally is reckoning with settler colonialism, with long histories of racism, and to attempt to isolate and insulate the university from that seems unwise and just, I mean, it's just wrong morally, but also sociologically. We cannot possibly kind of box the university into some kind of ivory tower unaffected by everything else that's going on in the world. These are things that are happening in the world, and the university is part of that.
Thank you. Alejandro, I'll turn it back to you. You might have a question or a comment, or if you...
I have, but it's only 3 minutes. 3 minutes. And the question I'm going to ask is going to demand a full day. So yeah, I prefer not to answer the question.
I'd love to hear it, Alejandro. I might not answer it given the time, but I think it's worth offering to think about.
Okay, well, it's very connected to this conversation about the university, and also connected to the work you are doing, JP. The work you're doing is community-based, community-oriented, and also it has a very important educational side. But in 2020, 2021, curiosity was everywhere. There was a lot of curiosity for these topics, and there was a kind of eagerness to learn, an eagerness to reflect, an eagerness to basically to revisit things. Now, with this kind of very well orchestrated backlash, you see that curiosity either fading away or even resistance to learn anymore. So what are we going to do in this particular context in which people are disengaged, people are not interested, or people are opposing to the possibility of learning about these things? And without that learning, without the support, this work becomes incredibly difficult, becomes very, very, very like really challenging for people engaged in this particular kind of, endeavor. So that was my question.
Yeah. I think that's a really important question, Alejandro. And, as in the minute that I have left, one thing I'll just say is that the interest is there. We just need to have a look at where that is coming from. My work in community tells me that there is very much interest. They might not be who we typically go to gauge interest, but they exist. There is a kind of hunger for this kind of for our communities by our communities research, right? And so going there might be one way forward, noticing those we haven't noticed before and haven't paid as much attention to, might be the fuel that we need in this kind of context of kind of backlash, retrenchment, etc.
Thank you so much, and what perfect timing. It's exactly 2:30. Really want to thank you for taking the time and the time you put into this presentation, your thoughtfulness, and the challenges, in fact, that I think you've identified for us to think about, as well as the opportunities about how we can support Asian Canadian heritage, Asian Canadian research, teaching, and community engagement. So thank you so much for taking time. It's great to connect with colleagues from UBC. And I want to thank Alejandro as well, and the Communications and Multimedia Services folks for supporting the event. Thank you everybody who joined us today and for spending time with us in this space. I appreciate that as well. And with that, we'll just again wish a warm goodbye to Dr. Catungal and thank him very much for the presentation. Thank you so much, everybody. Very good to see you all.
Thank you, folks. And I also just want to recognize that I recognize some folks in the audience from outside UBC and Royal Road. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Goodbye.